his midges punctuating dusk. But I don't like the dance. When I think of dusk, it seems a kind of slow, settling sensation, not a dancing one.
Coming here and spending time with Caroline is incredibly helpful because for somebody of her stature, she comes across as somebody you'd meet in the pub. And yet, in these one-to-one tutorials and in the workshops, there's a sudden switch to a very incisive way of thinking about things.
I think another draft, and you would have quite an electrifying piece.
Right.
So maybe we could look at it again.
Definitely, yes.
You went to Liverpool, and the Liverpool scene that was going on, it was extraordinary few years in Liverpool. What would you pluck out from that as the thing that took you into, really set you on the path to what you became?
Yeah. Well, I came to Liverpool in 1974, and by that time there wasn't a music scene. The Beatles had long gone, and I think quite a few of the Liverpool poets had moved to London as well. So the Liverpool I knew was painters, performance artists and playwrights. And of course Adrian Henry, who was a painter and a poet himself, really was the kind of heart and soul of Liverpool. Everyone who came stayed at his house, everything moved through him. He was also a fantastic teacher.
When you say Adrian Henry was a good teacher, were you taking a steer from him in any way?
No, Adrian would be more likely to say, you've got to come and see this exhibition, you've got to come to this concert, you've got to meet so-and-so. And yes, it was a bit like having a kind of going to a finishing school. I think Willie Russell, who was around, has written a very unkind song called Adrian Henry's Finishing School for Girls, which kind of lists all the girlfriends who went through at that time.
There was quite a lot of performance poetry in Liverpool at the time, as I understand it. Did you perform your own poetry there? Is that why you got a grounding in the idea of performance poetry?
Yes, the Everyman Theatre, again with Adrian, had a regular series of poetry reading where you'd get a kind of famous poet coming, and then newer, younger poets would have the chance to read with the visiting poets. So I was very much part of that. I don't know any of them were performance poets, but certainly if you look at someone like Christopher Logue, there were poets who could perform their poetry. They had ways of using their voice, of moving on stage, of perhaps introducing their poems, engaging with the audience, that was very entertaining. And that was a good education to see poetry come alive in that way. By Christ, he could bore for purgatory. He was small, didn't prepossess, so he tried to impress. Dead men, Mrs. Aesop, he'd say, tell no tales. Well, let me tell you now that bird in his hand sat on his sleeve. Never mind the two worth less in the bush. Tedious. Going out was worst. He'd stand at our gate, look, then leap. Scour the hedgerows for a shy mouse, the fields for a sly fox, the sky for one particular swallow that couldn't make a summer. The jackdaw, according to him, envied the eagle. Donkeys would, on the whole, prefer to be lions. On one appalling evening stroll, we passed an old hare snoozing in a ditch. He stopped and made a note. And then, about a mile further on, a tortoise. Somebody's pet. Creeping, slow as marriage, up the road. Slow but certain Mrs. Aesop wins the race. Asshole.
Is there any sense in which you took performance into account when you were writing your poetry?
Well, I think a poem should be readable aloud to others, but I don't think the thought of the listeners should dictate what you put on the page. I think it all becomes one, the sound and the shape and how a poem looks on the page it all becomes a kind of living event.
It sounds like a pretty heady brew, the Liverpool experience. Do you think you've been sort of drawing from it ever since?
Yes, I mean, in that sense, I wouldn't be probably a poet at all if I hadn't lived in Liverpool and hadn't had the experiences I had. Action, Mrs. A, speaks louder than words, and that's another thing. The sex was diabolical. I gave him a fable one night about a little cock that wouldn't crow. A razor-sharp axe with a heart blacker than that pot that cooled the kettle. I'll cut off your tail, all right, I said, to save my face. That shut him up. I laughed last. Longest.
What's your inspiration? The South Bank Show, sponsored by the Open University.
Scotland at the Movies, a documentary looking at some of the most memorable films with Scottish influence.
It's such a brilliant film.
I don't think there's a man alive who doesn't recognise all of that stuff that Gregory goes through.
It's fundamentally a romantic comedy, with an essence in it which fascinates people, and that is magic.
Whiskey Galore stood the test of time. It's a brilliant piece of work.
Comfort and Joy is definitely worth watching.
It's a melancholy comedy.
Thursday at 9 on STV.
Dr. Daniel Fenn, my Mr. Right.
We spent the night together.
Yeah, sleep.
If Dan isn't Mr. 11, if he's actually Mr. 10, then I haven't married Mr. 11. Now is not the time to go all Carol Vorderman, you freak. When you meet the right man, you just know.
The only man I sleep with from now on is the one I am rock solid certain is Mr. Right. My Mr. 11.
Brand new drama, Mr. 11, next Friday at 9 on STV.
What's your inspiration? The South Bank Show, sponsored by the Open University.
The Today programme, BBC phoned me and pointed out that the last two World War I veterans who died very closely together were being buried, and would I write a poem for the programme? Last post. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If poetry could tell it backwards, true. Begin that moment shrapnel scythed you to the stinking mud. But you get up, amazed, watch bled, bad blood run upwards from the slime into its wounds. See lines and lines of British boys rewind back to their trenches, kiss the photographs from home, mothers, sweethearts, sisters, younger brothers not entering the story now to die and die and die. Dulce, no. Decorum, no. Pro patria mori, you walk away.
You range very widely in your poems. I wouldn't like to leave this without talking about the range. Are you looking for nudges from what is happening around us now, as well as working through an internal journey?
I don't know that one looks for subjects. I think poetry selects its own occasions or finds its own occasions without the poet seeking. I've had long periods, which I'm quite comfortable with, of silence as an adult poet. Other times I will be writing very quickly and a lot. And sometimes the subjects will come from the outside world.
Like the latest two published ones that I read, the politics and the...
Last Post.
The Last Post, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
You walk away, drop your gun, fix bayonet, like all your mates do too. Harry, Tommy, Wilfred, Edward, Bert, and light a cigarette. There's coffee in the square, warm French bread, and all those thousands dead, are shaking dried mud from their hair and queuing up for home. Freshly alive, a lad plays Tipperary to the crowd, released from history. The glistening, healthy horses fit for heroes, kings. You lean against a wall, your several million lives still possible and crammed with love, work, children, talent, English beer, good food. You see the poet tuck away his pocketbook and smile. If poetry could truly tell it backwards, then it would. Poets experience feeling through language. That's what makes poets different from painters or musicians. The experience of deep feeling or original idea or imaginative leap is experienced by a poet as language. Immediately. It comes at once. There isn't even a second between the idea and the first bit of language.
If we take a poem that I like very, very much, A Child's Sleep, can you tell us how that came about and how you worked it through?
Yes, A Child's Sleep is the last poem in the first book of poems for children that I published. And it's right at the end because it's kind of secretly for the parent who might be reading the book with the child. And I wrote it when Ella, my daughter, was maybe just 2. And there's that lovely moment when the little child has fallen asleep, and there's a very sacred moment when you watch their sleep, and there they are with all innocence and their pre-language almost. They have no history.
Wordlessly good.
Wordlessly good, yeah. And it's such a beautiful and privileged moment that I wanted to try and capture that for myself, but also in a poem for other people who might read to a child or be there in that way. I stood at the edge of my child's sleep, hearing her breathe. Although I could not enter there, I could not leave. Her sleep was a small wood, perfumed with flowers, dark, peaceful, sacred, acred in hours. And she was the spirit that lives in the heart of such woods, without time, without history, wordlessly good.
So is it possible to reconstruct how that was arrived at? The idea of the wood, the idea of the sacred, the idea of wordlessly good, the cupped hand, all of that?
Yes, I mean, I remember being in the room, which is her bedroom. I think the poem starts, I stood at the edge of my child's sleep, so I wanted the idea of perhaps being at the edge of a wood or a field, and I could hear the little child breathing. The moment impressed itself so forcibly upon me that what happens is language gets squeezed out. It's a bit like squeezing a lemon. You know, you'll get the juice of the lemon, and that's what tends to happen with the moment that a poem begins. There's a pressure of the event on the part of you that is the poet. And probably the part of you that is human. I mean, we would all feel that even if we didn't use the language of a poem to discuss it or express it. I spoke her name. A pebble dropped in the still night and saw her stir, both open palms cupping their soft light, then went to the window. The greater dark outside the room gazed back, maternal, wise, with its face of moon.
You said words to the effect that you were another person before Ella was born. You almost don't recognise.